Yeah, so cool that we made it to
Yeah.
this interview, which turns out an interview now.
Right.
Yeah, it's just a backstory for you guys. So Chris sent me this paper on structure-oriented collaboration, and I read it, and I thought, "Oh, this is interesting." And I reread it, and yeah, I just got the impulse of saying, "Let's do a little interview," since I prepared a little for this. So let's just dive in and tease out what's
Sounds
interesting
great.
about this new approach. So this is more a little bit spontaneous, but yeah,
Right.
definitely spurred by my interest and yeah, the density of the topic. So that's really
Wow. Yeah. I'm
that's
so glad. Yeah. Happy to dive in and let you kind of pick it up wherever you want. You did send some comments. I went through all your comments as well. So yeah, I'm
yeah. So let's just see where it goes. So this paper that you wrote is called "Making Rules Matter: Toward a Theory of Structure-Oriented Collaboration," and you handed this into which journal was it again?
it's a new one. It's called integration, part of the what's it called? Integral applied
Meta theory.
meta. Yeah.
That I am right. Yeah,
Yeah.
cool. I
Institute of Applied Meta Theory.
yeah,
That's what it is.
that's cool. So yeah. So first of all, what is structure-oriented collaboration, and what is this thing? Like in broad strokes, what is it about? What did you research, and what can you already tell us about it?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, the paper was a really good occasion to try to answer that question. I'll say it that way.
Mhm.
I even at one point in the draft, ultimately is in this version of it, kind of says, "Hey, what I'm about to explain in this paper is still kind of being figured out. It's not being presented as like, oh, here's this fully fleshed out model, or it's still being figured out, though." Where it is seems like it's starting to settle into some patterns, and there are some consistent results and consistent ways of looking at things.
Mhm.
And it was structured, again, as this the requirements of this new journal, apply some of this integral methodological pluralism, which again, I um, kind of believe in or use anyway. So it kind of was this overlapping of all these different things to try to kind of wrangle the idea and put it into a particular kind of package. A lot of stuff that had been implicit in my mind, intuitive, or like I knew this was true, or felt this was true, but now I have to try to actually try to explain how and why and how I got there, which means that, in terms of like the research process, was really just trying to articulate what I had kind of found myself doing, which I can explain more about that or how I got there.
Mhm.
But to write the paper, it was like, how do I explain this in terms of like research or more of a method? What was my method?
Mhm.
And in the paper, it makes this argument, right, that like the perspective that I'm taking typically is very much like individual, subjective, phenomenological kinds of research in a way, which
Mhm.
meant like, yeah, okay, so me being in holacracy practice for so long, trying to coach it, trying to understand it, all that, and then metabolizing it and the way I kind of work to try to come up with distinctions and metaphors and models, like that actually kind of was my methodology, has been my methodology, and how I've ended up to try to write the paper to kind of now say, all right, folks, this is my best attempt thus far to try to put the pieces out there for critique, right? For testing, critique, research, etc.
Yeah, so and for those people who I mean, you're directly diving into the kind of the uh the approach of uh the methodology and so on, how you do this. But if we zoom out a little more, so it is about collaboration, right? So it's about forms of collaboration for those who may not know us or are not in the scene, so to speak. So this is
Right.
about self-management, for example, and Holacracy is a part of it, but also general more than that. So can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, well, this is where again I really try to make it coherent and keep it like this is what it's about, and then it ends up wiggling and being like, well, yes, it is about collaboration. Yes, that's kind of how how this paper's framed and how I generally think of the idea. It can get
Hmm.
very philosophical,
Yeah.
and applicable. So I played with different ways of framing it, but I would say the layman's terms approach is like, yeah, it's kind of like a version of proposing a field of study or a research program that's more oriented to how rules, structures, policies, even roles, anything with a prescriptive binding element to it, like we should follow that, there's an agreement, all that. How do those actually work? The paper itself tries to kind of say, I'm leaving the scope out of like society level stuff, like laws, though there's a lot of relevance. And it's more, yeah, more about, from my holacracy experience of like, hey, we get together, we have the Constitution, and we use that to create, governance, and then we're supposed to use that, and by virtue of being in Holacracy One and kind of in the mothership, and getting an accelerated course and trying to see how it's supposed to work, realize like, wow, this is a lot about how we communicate, regardless of what's written. But it's not just about how we communicate, right? It's not just these kind of cultural interventions. Let's focus on the communication aspect and being very empowering and supportive. It's not really that. It's like, yeah, the structure of holacracy really works well, but not just on its own, right? It's not just it's its own thing that will auto enforce.
Hmm.
So how do I figure all of this stuff out? And that's, the actual theory or the method is kind of this extension of that, of the answers that I've gotten along that question. And what I found was that the resolutions, or the distinctions that I needed to help explain holacracy stuff, um, that I've been building, when you really think about what these things are, I think they are broadly applicable. You don't even need holacracy now, to apply and understand the distinctions. That's the kind of hypothesis, yeah, my
So
experience. Yeah.
yeah, so you start the paper off with saying, I mean, you mentioned this briefly, that this term of rules is actually pretty fuzzy one, right? So
Yeah.
people talk about rules, and there's research about rules and enforcement of rules and follow through on rules or not, and but the people seem to be referring to different things. So what are you referring to when you say rule?
Yeah, I use like a nested set of definitions, meaning I think these are all accurate and they kind of get more complex. But I think on one level, it's like requirements, something that's required
Hmm.
day to day. I think that generally fits. Below that, and maybe I'll just highlight this without having to get into too much of the minutia of it, because I think this is kind of the single anchor point, or the main distinction, um, is defining it as an independent cause for action. It's like you create a rule, an expectation. I define them as ongoing, explicit, and prescriptive expectations, which I suppose, yeah, is itself kind of novel, and we could unpack that a little bit more. But it's a bit more nuanced. Each of those things needs to be described. But behind that is this idea of like it's an independent reason why you might do something, meaning above and beyond just logic or the circumstance or an incentive or a desire you have, right? Like the reason rules work when they work, like what they're supposed to do is provide an independent cause for action for a person, right? And so someone in authority typically who wants to establish an expectation can write that down, communicate it, and then that expectation can kind of do work in their absence.
Triggers action with actors.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Hmm.
Yeah, philosophically, I think that's kind of how I think about what a rule is, which as you say opens it up, a bit to like, so it could be, a policy fits my definition of a rule, or a role description, a strategy, a priority, anything that's used in those four, if it's explicit, enduring or ongoing, and prescriptive, then it would fit.
And so if you drill down a little bit deeper, so you distinguish between descriptive and prescriptive. Can you elaborate on that a little? So
Oh
what do you
yeah.
mean by
Yeah.
prescriptive?
This is exciting to me. This is so years ago, actually. This was so, years ago, holacracy stuff. Brian, I think it was Brian. Brian definitely said it. Brian Robertson, founder of Holacracy One and Constitution writer. Um, would kind of use, what was the phrase now? It was something like if like a rule or an agreement isn't explicit, then you have no right to expect it or something like that.
You cannot lean on that or on that
Yeah,
implicitly.
you can't rely on it, which, again, there's a way that I love that and makes perfect sense. But in my, trying to really grok what holacracy meant and how this all the distinctions I needed, there was a way it definitely did not make sense. Like that definitely did not make sense to me that in real life, you must always have something made explicit up front in order for you to have a right to feel disturbed or uncomfortable, right? Encountering something that's unexpected.
Hmm.
And what I realized, at least the way I like to think about it, which gets to this descriptive versus prescriptive, was that an expectation, which is just, something you think is going to happen in the future, right? That if we think of these as two different types of expectation, a descriptive one, which is more like based on the past, I
This
think this
will
is,
happen or like.
yeah, yeah, this is likely to occur. Dennis is a cool guy. I expect him to show up to this call or whatever, right? Like if I ask him if he's willing to do this thing, it's likely that he'll say yes to it, right? And day to day, that generally works out just fine and it covers us pretty well.
Yeah.
Now, prescriptive though is of this other class, which is like, oh, but that's when you make an agreement,
Hmm.
right? And it says, oh yes, I'll meet you for this call that we have at this time, and that provides some normative force to say, yeah, I'm going to meet you there in that Zoom room because we agreed to it. In other words, you do it because you feel like you should do it.
Yeah.
Um, and in practice, that distinction ends up, I think, being really critical. And that's kind of why framing rules as prescriptive expectations to me feels so important to provide and contain or continue the parallel with the descriptive expectations. To kind of make it clear, like, hey, these two things are always together, and that's fine until we need to separate them. And if you don't have language for separating them, then you are a bit in trouble.
Hmm. The other part was the explicit. So you said it's like prescriptive that we covered
Yeah.
that.
Uh,
Explicit is what do you mean by that?
yeah,
How?
we could just think written down, you
Yeah.
know.
Okay. So it's kind of what Holacracy does a lot, like writing things down. All
Exactly. Yeah.
right.
And I'll also highlight one of the reasons, Dennis, that's so critical to me is most of the time, if you look at what research and what discussions or, whatever philosophy, even up to now about rules, is you either have stuff like in legal theory, which is like very, this is what's written, and then how does that, how does legitimacy work and all that. But if you're more in like organizational studies or social science, even broadly, rules are really like second or third class objects. What really matters, this is what are norms.
Hmm.
Norms, what people, the way they actually behave, whether or not it's written down, right? What we really need to care about are the norms. And so that as the framing, right, then puts rules kind of way down here as kind of like,
The intent.
insulary, something like, yeah.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying norms are not important, right? I'm saying norms are extreme, they're definitely more important, I would, in a way, right? They're more foundational. But using integral language, right? We could say rules are more significant, right?
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
like, right, they do something, the very fact that they are explicit. Yeah.
Okay. And the norms are usually or often quite implicit, right?
Yeah.
So that's okay.
Yeah.
The other part was ongoing versus like once only or one off or
Yeah. Yeah,
all
and
right.
that's more for convenience. I mean, I haven't myself like, in other words, part of the reason why explicit makes sense, part of it is all of the other elements really matter is because the person isn't there, right? It's like in the absence of where the agreement was made. So if I tried to include one time, then we have these occasions, right, where it's like you and I are, hey, talking about something like, hey, let's meet over there, or let's all walk over to the restaurant or something, right? And you're like, well, what exactly is that phenomenon? It's like I wanted to just leave those out, right? There's too many things going on in the field of those moments. And there's a long thread and even legal theory that tries to talk about the history of like threats of violence, like the only real normative force laws have is because of the threat of violence. And this gets into this, there's quite a bit of a debate about whether or not the one-time command is kind of equal to a rule. I tend to side with those that are like, I think it's best to treat them as separate. So I do.
Okay. So let's return a bit to some of the key findings. Maybe a key claim you say there is a drift towards explicit structure that's observable. You want to rewind something?
I want to ask you a question.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, because I'm happy to answer these questions.
sure.
For anyone that wants to watch the video and is like, oh, what's this about? Again,
Yeah.
but I'm also particularly interested in your. I got
Hmm.
your comments, and there were some good suggestions and things too. But I'm
Hmm.
also curious, like, what did you think? How did you process it? What was your reaction?
To the whole thing or to anything
Yeah,
particular?
I,
Yeah,
yeah.
no,
I mean, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
at first it was a bit overwhelming, I would say, because I felt it was pretty dense, packed
Yeah.
with all kinds of distinctions and so on. And I really had to kind of wrap my head around, okay, where does he want to go with this? What's the intention? Maybe I will ask you about this again.
Mhm.
But my sense was you wanted to distill explanatory categories that make navigating Holacracy or other systems easier for people to navigate. You talk about participant navigability
Uh-huh.
as
Yeah.
as
Nailed
a
it.
kind of yeah, something that you want to do with this model, like help people to better find their way around and understand what this whole deal is with structures and with rules and how they work or don't work, and how can we use this to diagnose situations where it didn't work, and yeah, establish some core findings that we come to those. I mean, those I found helpful. I There's a lot that resonated with me. I really like the you have this model of the four, what was that, four participant standpoints: agent,
Oh yeah.
author, enforcer, analyst, which is kind of, yeah, it's really a participant. It's like a first person kind of uh, um, you can view this from the first person. Of course, you can also look at it. I mean, it's derived from a third person view in the sense you describe something, but then you can use it as a map to navigate and interpret the terrain of collaboration as an agent, as an author of a rule, as an enforcer of a rule, as an analyst of a rule. And I like also, yeah, this non-alienation idea, which we'll get into hopefully, that you know these things are there to reduce the need for like guesswork,
Mhm.
like guessing what people would like you. And this whole point, or this whole kind of trying to zoom out a bit and trying to um, help us understand holacracy better, but also other forms of collaboration that deal with rules. And that I found useful, and also to look at different levels. You call them registers, uh,
Yeah.
um,
Hmm.
like on the individual level, on the organizational level, but maybe also at the state level, societal level. How can we view rules? How can we look at legitimacy? That I found pretty useful. We'll look
Oh,
at
right.
that.
That was the diagram. Yeah, the diagram. Yeah.
The diagram, yeah,
Or
okay.
lack thereof.
Yeah, the lack thereof, whichever. Like how can we understand different types of legitimacy, not just like a flatland version of legitimacy, but a legitimacy that is like multidimensional and gives us a little better understanding of what the phenomenon is that we're experiencing here. And because that's what maps, good concepts and good maps do, they help us make sense of what we're experiencing in a deeper way. So that's that's all the aspects that I found
Yeah,
helpful.
man, that's great. That was a great, yeah, it was a
Yeah.
great summary
Yeah.
too. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but let's unpack this a little because for the for anyone listening or watching, this might be a little abstract as of now because yeah, that's also but my first impression. It was a bit abstract, and felt like okay, I need to wrangle this. I need to chew on this a bit, and also I need to talk to you about it. So that's
Yeah.
what we're doing now. So let's get into
Yeah.
it.
Let's get into it. That's great.
Okay, so one of the key findings of yours is that you say we can observe a drift towards explicit structure in collaboration. What do you mean by that, and how does that express itself, and how does it express in normal organizations, but also maybe in self-managed organizations like Holacracy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a foundational kind of claim. I think in the paper, I basically say I'm not really going to try to prove this. I'm going to kind of just try to stipulate it somewhat. I think it is provable, but I'll do a version of that now. The drift towards explicitness is essentially just meaning that when you get people together, because we can't read each other's minds, we have to communicate and make explicit things that we might not otherwise need to make explicit.
Mhm.
So, the manifestations of this are things like, you could have a group of people that are from the same community and they all know each other. They have this, the same beliefs and values roughly, right? They eat the same kinds of food, the Amish barn raising, Amish people putting together barn. They've got so much shared context that a lot of things don't need to be made explicit and in fact shouldn't probably be made explicit. It would be weird or awkward or it would make things worse, right? Um, uh,
Yeah,
on the other hand,
that's
yeah.
also just to stop you there. That's an interesting phenomenon. You mentioned this awkwardness of like making rules explicit. Can you say a little more about that? So if
About
I'm an Amish person and I say I would ask my neighbor, I'm a new guy, and I would like, could you help me raise the barn? Well,
oh
how would that be awkward in that
yeah,
cultural
you mean like
context, for
if
example?
you're not in that group and you need to interact with that group? Is that what you mean?
No, if I'm in that group and but I would like you to make it like, can we agree on this, please?
Oh, and why that would be awkward. Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, for those same reasons. I mean, another one that people can maybe relate to is like a friend, says they'll help you move or something, and you're like, "Hey, could I, oh, great, thank you. Could you put that in writing and email me or something, right?" And they would be
Right,
like,
right.
"Wait, right, like that's huh?" Or if you ask, yeah, you got they're asked them, got a group of Amish people together and asked them, like what their values are, right? Like
Mhm.
they may be able to explain them, but they would probably just be like, well, and they would think of it only being useful for me, right? It's not useful for them. Um, Again, and by extension, then now let's introduce a new person. Now imagine there's a stranger that enters the picture, right? And there's a low shared context.
Yeah.
Well, again, I don't feel like it's something I really need to even prove other than just to lay out some of the logic of like, well, if you don't have a lot of the same context, you need to find a way to navigate that, and the way that that gets navigated is you tend to make things explicit, which then, I don't want to jump ahead, but the condition that then comes with that is all of this awkwardness. It's both necessary and necessarily awkward to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's what happens a lot in organizations on this meso level, let's say,
Yeah.
that we have fluctuation and context gets lost, or people don't have the context, and that for that reason, it's increasingly like useful to have explicit agreements or explicit structure, right?
Yeah, and I would almost say it kind of like, yeah, and it seems to be. I almost think of it like I try to take a very neutral stance in terms of like structure and the amount of it. Is the amount of it good or bad? I'm completely neutral on. I think in other words, I wouldn't want it to be misconstrued as more explicitness is better. I definitely don't think that. I just think because we are increasingly dealing with people that don't have the same beliefs and values and backgrounds, right? We have this drift, and that's the part I would say is kind of implicit in a lot of modern work, especially. And just the fact that that is there, that drift is in the background, means we need to be prepared for how to navigate that into it during it, out of it, when it's no longer necessary. We need to be thinking about need to think about collaboration somewhat in those terms.
Mhm.
Yeah.
All right, so let's look at some more of those key distinctions and models that you propose or
Yeah.
distill from your experience and serve us up as a navigational device or map or whatever you want to say. So let's start with legitimacy types. What do you mean by legitimacy types, and how do they combine, and what are the effects, and how can we visualize this?
Yeah. Well, let me see how to approach the question. What are legitimacy? Okay, so I would almost say for anybody watching this, um, let's maybe not worry so much about what the word tends to evoke in terms of the technical legalese thing. And think of it more in terms of like, again, like with a friendly group of people working together. You could almost think of it of like trust, right? And this idea of like your interactions with those people help kind of establish a certain amount of implicit trust that you have with them. And then each new interaction is impacted by the trust you have going in, right? So it kind of reflects the trust and reinforces the trust. So trust can be broken, and then you try to make a new agreement, and then you have less trust. I think of legitimacy from an organizational perspective, right? Very much like trust in that same way of the friends, of like each rule exists within with a background of legitimacy there. So, whether or not to follow it is always going to be, interpreted against this kind of background of legitimacy.
Mhm.
When you get to organizations or groups, it gets a little bit more complicated because in most circumstances, unlike, let's say, the friend group, right, you're not, you weren't there necessarily, or the expectation isn't that you need to be there. You have a lot of corporate policies, in other words, that were written before you were there that you're expected to follow. Okay, so you don't have that context, but yet you're supposed to follow it. And what I tried to figure out was, is there a difference between like how I might interact with a rule in an organization? And again, Holacracy 1 was kind of like my test bed in a way where I would realize like, hey, good Holacracy practice um, runs me into these occasions where there's a policy or a domain, and I might not like that policy, I might not like that domain or whatever, but I have to kind of contend with it, right? And I was like, well, what? This is weird because most people don't really think, don't have this problem, right? And most organizations where they don't have pathways to impact or to adapt, you hit a rule and you're like, who's watching, basically? Like, what are the consequences? Could I kind of get away with not having to follow it if it feels like it's not reasonable in this circumstance? If you're new, then you are going to really try to stick to it. If you've got more context, you might be able to work around it. So I was like, well, this is a strange phenomenon. This is basically the phenomena of like, I experience this policy as legitimate, as having a right to bind me, even if I don't like it.
Mhm.
Uh, and I use this metaphor, I think, in the paper of like, it's like hitting a red light or something when you're driving, right? Like you get to the red light comes, you might not like it, right? It's really annoying, gets in your way, but you experience it as having a legitimate right to make you stop,
Mhm.
right? And that is a different kind of legitimacy than the kind of system level legitimacy, which is more about, did that policy itself kind of get created by following the agreed upon rules of the organization? Generally speaking, they have. That's something that organizations tend to pay a lot of attention to. And so, yes, like the appropriate person had the right to encode that expectation, and so they did so and they followed it. Um, and as soon as you end up with like two versions of a similar thing, then my brain immediately goes to like some sort of like matrix of like, okay, what if we kind of combine them in weird ways and see if that explained anything? And
Mhm.
that's what I did. And it I think it turned out to me at least to try to, it did explain some things that you could have actually really high system legitimacy, right? I recognize that technically speaking, this rule followed, the way the system's supposed to work. And yet I could still experience it as not having the right to bind me. And I have to contend, and I have to figure out a way around that. And the inverse can also be true. meaning I could experience something as having the right to bind me, even though I feel like it didn't actually follow technically what like the official explicit right sanctioning body. In other words, like a manager just making something up,
Mhm.
right? Like where yes, there's a lot of stuff written down. Yes, the higher ups think that this is how we do things, but within our team, we know Bob calls the shots, and Bob said he wanted me to wash his car this weekend. And I experienced that as having the rights to bind me, right? But it feels a little, does feel a little weird, right? Because there's
You
no,
call it, I think you call it exploitative.
yeah, there, exactly, right.
Right.
Yeah.
So you
Or,
have these different categories. So let's summarize. So you first of all you just differentiate between structural legitimacy and
right.
experiential legitimacy. And so if the structural legitimacy is high, like you like yeah, that's the policy or whatever that was in place before you arrive, and you feel bound by it, but it may still you don't may not like it, so you develop this kind of resentful feeling towards it, but you still respect it, kind of like
Yeah, you respect it, but for different reasons, kind of, right? You're not respecting it because you feel like it has the right to bind you. That's in a way you could say that's what we would want. A good rule,
yeah.
right, would do that. Yeah.
So yes, so you this one kind of quadrant, if you make the matrix, is
Right.
of stable obligation would be or healthy binding is when structural legitimacy is high and experiential legitimacy is high too, right? So
Yeah.
it feels legit and it's also structurally laid down in appropriate ways, right? That
Yeah, reviewable, contestable,
mhm.
right? Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Right, and then you have this kind of quadrant where there's the shadow authority comes into play, or what we just called exploitative, where the structural legitimacy is low, but the experiential legitimacy is high. Like we feel like
Mhm.
Bob has the right to make me wash his car, and if I
Right,
don't, oh, bad things
right,
that happen, right? Okay,
right.
right. So this is I found this helpful to yeah, it made sense to me. So gave me some kind of mental framework to look at these kinds of phenomena. I think um, it's useful as a distinction. So just as a feedback
Mhm.
as a
Yeah, good.
practitioner.
Yeah, thanks.
And yeah, so
Oh, can I add? Because I don't know if I don't think I really got into this in the paper, but it's an important thing, maybe in the background of this whole legitimacy kind of conversation,
Mhm.
is that there's a lot of findings that, I mean, or I had an observation and found support in other literature that people tend to feel much better about outcomes that followed like a fair process. In other words, the legitimacy process is
Mhm.
itself something that tells, right? Like if I know the process was fair, but even if I don't like the outcome, I can live with it, right? This is part back to the red light example, right? That's
Yeah,
part of why.
you wrote about this in the
Okay.
papers. I
Yeah,
think, yeah,
cool.
yeah. So yeah, and I think that's maybe that's an experience actually I can relate to from Holacracy because I went through the governance process and there was an outcome I didn't like, but I really feel it there. Like okay, I had the chance to raise objections and I did, and it was it didn't work or it didn't work the way I would have hoped to, but the process is fair and the facilitator was not they were neutral, they were sticking to the rules.
Neutral.
So
Yeah.
these are the rules. If we don't like it, they make other rules, but as long as we
Right.
play by these rules, I guess I have to
Yeah.
follow
Right.
it, right? Yeah, that's that experience I had, so that made sense for
Cool.
me.
Cool.
Totally. And you, okay, so this would be a kind of an experience of there is a role being encoded, which might be a segue to the next
Yeah.
kind of model that you bring in. And maybe I just share the screen here, maybe
I
for
was just going to say, yeah.
simplicity. You got this four-part, how would you say it, four-part structure system.
Yeah.
So you have so the rule is at the center, and you have these four agent perspectives. How would you call this? So take
No,
it.
I would say, yeah, I tend to call this like I'll call them aspects or dimensions,
Mhm.
and I think you highlighted the right thing. I would just emphasize for anybody looking at this that like the way I think about this is like, yeah, there's the rule, the agreement is in the center, and it's like a parameter. We're not sure what that is, but it all only makes sense if we assume there's something there, right?
Mhm.
And then the question that this is trying to kind of help answer is like, does that matter? And if so, why? And if not, why? Like, how does that become stable or not stable within the group?
Mhm.
And so each of those aspects are norms that support, right, these different kind of aspects or dimensions. Some people call them phases and think of it, that way. I don't tend, that is
I
true. I
I
just tend to,
looked at this, and what came to my mind was like, okay, these are different roles that we assume as agents in the system
oh,
towards rules, like because roles are also in a way evoke perspectives. They
well, this is, I think I mean, here's what I think how you might be connecting them is something like enforcing here, right? Does have the analog in enforcer,
Mhm.
participant role,
Right.
though I don't think of them as necessarily being, or encoder, encoder isn't, uh, what is it? Oh, it's author, right? Like the encoding kind of equals the author role. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there are some overlaps, but I don't think of these as roles in
Okay.
this model. Yeah,
You
there's a different
think
model
they're
for
just
role.
aspects. Okay, let's enumerate them because some people might listen to this, maybe just audio, who knows. So we have A, norms that support exploring the structure. We have B, norms that's no wait B, norms that support encoding the structure, like laying it down.
Mhm.
Then C, norms that support enforcing the structure, and D, norms that support evolving the structure. So what's this exploring business about?
Yeah. So that's important, I think, that my observation slash, hypothesis is that this is about trying to figure out if you need to have a structure.
Mhm.
It's not the only thing that's about, but I'll just lead, that's the headline, right? Part of the reason that's important is essentially something like, okay, there's a tension, there's an issue, right? I want something to be different. Now, the exploring, in a kind of a traditional management hierarchy, might be like the manager before they go about creating a new, hourly, you must submit your timesheet on this day or whatever, right? Or you must adjust your shifts, whatever change they want to make. They might go about, right, exploring the idea, right? Talking to staff members, seeing what do they think, right? All of that stuff that's
Is it
happening.
even necessary to write something down, or could we just appeal to people's kind of reason?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, so like in a holacracy governance meeting, I would say the governance meeting itself largely includes both exploring and encoding, right? Encoding, from a holacracy governance meeting perspective is just when the secretary hits accept, basically, right? That's the literal kind of like now it's official. Before that, it's largely this kind of right with this line of like you're exploring it slash trying to figure out the phrasing, which so part of that difference is convenience to kind of make sure I can each bucket's got significant stuff that we can talk about, but the exploring idea is all the stuff that happens kind of yeah before you're really looking to encode a new rule.
Okay, so we got that part, and then norms support enforcing the structure. So once we lay down those, we establish those rules. How are they being enforced, and what norms do we have there?
Yep. Yep. How consistently is it enforced? Who does the enforcing? How would you know if something's broken? Yeah, things like that.
And why is that important?
Well, again, I don't think it's much of a stretch to say if we took that out and we said we wrote all this stuff down and we got a lot of clarity about it,
Mhm.
but did not care a lick
So,
about return,
what,
right? It's like, well, then it's just right.
yeah,
It's not going
do
to do anything.
words matter or don't they matter? Is what
Do
I.
they? Well, exactly. Right.
All right, okay, we
Mhm.
got that. And then we've got norms that support evolving the structure. And what's that all about?
Yeah, I would say that's about, Holacracy again informed a lot of how I saw this. So, this idea of the fact that we could change something that's already been encoded. It's already there. It's already, official, all of that stuff. This is like this whole perspective and understanding, like, well, you know what though? If we kept this for a week and then we had another meeting where we were going to reset and then decide whether or not it worked, right? We're going to have a place to think about what if we should carry, like, what does that do when you're trying to actually encode it for just that week? It changes it dramatically, right? It lowers the pressure and the temperature dramatically
Yeah,
when you're
yeah,
like, well, even if this is not great, even if the phrasing is a little vague, we're going to review it in a week. So what's the big deal?
right.
That's one element, and then the other element is just kind of like almost like garbage disposal. Like, how does the system, if it does at all, think about retiring, sunsetting, erasing existing expectations?
Yeah. I mean, that is a tension that I've encountered in organizations and also through the criticism of holacracy, which is, hey, this model leads to over formalization or hyper formalization. That's
Yeah.
one researchers' conclusion on this, and for me that is indication that this norm is not really kind of lived well. So I would argue it's a matter of holacracy maturity, that you feel that you
Completely.
should look at your governance from time to time and ask yourself, how can we keep it nimble and minimal, and get rid of things that don't look alive anymore.
Right.
Uh, but that's the one aspect, and the other aspect, which I really, that also I first learned through Holacracy, is that, the, as you said, the threshold for making like any encoding gets so much lower if you say, hey, look, this is an iterative process. It's never not etched in stone forever, but we can change this, and there's a process for that, and that is safe and reliable. And this is what I found really revolutionary when I first learned holacracy. Oh my God, we don't have to,
Yeah.
don't have to, because the cost of encoding it perfectly is so high. Because if you strive for perfection,
Yeah.
everything has to be like super vetted, and there's, especially in organizations that are very risk averse, that takes forever to decide on any fucking thing. Excuse my French, and that really drives the
Exactly.
costs high for encoding clarity, and which shouldn't the cost shouldn't be high. It should be as low as possible to get
Right.
clarity, right?
Well, and so yes, I think very well said, including the French. I think what gets exciting to me about this is we can now, if this is true, let's assume it's true, right? And this is true, we can now map things like holacracy and kind of show, oh, okay, it's really, and in fact, it has lots of really great rules, second order rules, to kind of establish all of these things, right? The governance process is an ongoing thing. The way it encodes is very clear. But it also allows us to now understand, all, like, again, this whole set, like how collaboration works almost everywhere, but in particular, programs or philosophies or approaches to governance that people get really passionate about can now both be understood, I think, better and in some ways challenged or complemented. So, for
Can you,
example,
yeah, thank you. I was just asking for an example, so I'll
so
give it
for
to you.
example, so
Yeah,
for example, any time that people talk about consent in decision making, right? Consent really matters. And I would say, yeah, sure, that's great. Although I would say that that is only in that kind of A or exploring and coding area. Yeah, that is a way to kind of increase the legitimacy, right? You get lots of good data from people. The encoding, what requires them that there's no objection, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say then that yes, that a consent-based approach, consent of the governed,
mhm,
is one solution to this overall the problem, the non-alienation issue or the alienation issue that governance is trying to solve. But I would also say that you don't just need consent, right? I would, or you can get some of the same benefits, right, without needing consent. So there are plenty of
Just
systems in
just
which
in
consent.
brackets, the alienation you're referring to is the alienation through the rule that you feel is not legitimate. maybe.
Yeah, I would say, or yeah, kind of think about like whatever experience you've had where like you don't like that rule stinks and is oppressive or bad or illogical, right? Like we want to avoid that experience. It will always probably happen, but minimize it, I would say. Avoid's probably not the
Yeah.
right word. Minimize it.
So, and the way to get about this would be consent, but and
So
we
that, well, I'm just saying, like, if you think of these as these four aspects, right, you start to think, well, there's probably like good and bad ways to make governance work better through each of them, right? So not only are they kind of interdependent, like you could, if you have better evolving processes, you're going to lower, like we said, the temperature or the threshold for encoding. So that's really cool if you think of it that way. But it also allows us to say, well, okay, in a traditional management hierarchy, you really practically or realistically are just not going to get consent for a lot of decisions.
right,
Those models that say you need consent, their only solution is to say, well, completely change how power works. You have to completely change how power works if you want to get consent. And all I'm saying is, yes, that's a solution. But if the goal is non-alienation, then and you can't have consent, look at the other aspects. There are other ways to reduce the likelihood of alienation. If you have many of them, sure, all the better. But it allows so much more flexibility. So, for example, back to the you can't have consent. What about enforcing flexibility? Right? What about being much more open to getting exceptions? Like, this is a rule, we're sticking to it. I know you didn't consent to it, but it is expected of you. But if you want an exception, right, ask me or something, right? Make the exception pathway easier or make the evolving pathway much clearer. This is the rule. You have to stick to it. But if you have feedback about it, submit this form or, these kinds of things, which again allow for us to understand all sorts of different ways to collaborate and provide all sorts of options.
right. So, one more question here. You write here norms that support, and then you have the four E's here: evolving, enforcing, encoding, exploring. And I find it significant that you choose norms. So norms is something that are, as we just established, something that's implicit, it's something that's in the culture. Or in integral speak, it's kind of the lower left quadrant of the quadrant model.
Mhm.
So what is this about? So why do you focus so much on the cultural dimension or in the intersubjective dimension? Why is that so important? And how is does it relate to, let's say, the way holacracy was viewed, let's say, before your model?
Yeah. Well, right. Yeah. I mean, and that is kind of maybe one of the big differences is that for me, it's just this kind of recognition. The simplest version is like rules don't self-enforce.
Mhm. So you need,
So
yeah. Hmm.
people, right? So it's like what we're really dealing with is communication, interpretation, meaning, culture, nor
Right.
in terms of giving, flesh on the bone, right? The mistake other, let's say, holacracy was trying to solve, and I still agree with, basically, right, is to say, look at all the leverage you can have with looking at the bones and the skeletons of these things, right? We can actually change that. And from my experience, that is true, but only with this investment of legitimacy, right?
Oh, may I extend your metaphor?
Yes.
Because if you say there's the bones, which is the structure, so let's deal with the structures, let's build better structures. But who's gonna move those structures if you don't have the muscles, right? And that's maybe the cultural part. Like,
Right.
right?
Exactly. Which, yeah.
All right, okay, so I get it. So it's this aspect is so it's not enough to just change the rules. You also have to get acceptance, or as you said, legitimacy, experiential legitimacy for something like holacracy. Because if you don't experience holacracy as legitimate, then you might just say it's nice and well what you decided in governance, but I don't care.
Right.
Then it doesn't help much, right?
Right.
Okay, so we got this out of the way. I was just wondering where to go from here. So we got other
Well, also
competitors.
timing wise, I can extend a little bit, Dennis. I'm not sure if you
Yeah, yeah,
can.
it's fine for me. Let's see. I can do whatever, another half hour or so if that's cool. Um,
I could
Yeah.
probably do another. I'm supposed to meet with my wife.
Yeah.
And I'm just texting her. So I could go maybe 15 past the hour.
Okay. Good.
Does that
Then
work? Okay, sweet.
we try to. Um, yeah. Let me just go back to this. So you So one aspect, and that you mentioned it a bit later in the paper, is so why do we find rules oppressive? Because we cannot change them. So they're kind of inflexible, and you have this polarity of, I would call it polarity of flexibility and
Yep.
stability. That's
All
kind
right.
of crucial. And I also encountered this when I responded to criticism of Holacracy, that it is being perceived sometimes, and if it's, I guess, if it's not practiced on a well evolved level, is that
Yep.
those rules kind of feel oppressive, or it's like, yeah, first of all, one is, you know, maybe people haven't done exploring well enough to figure out, should we should we encode something,
Yep.
and they just encode, and and then they never clean up, as we say, like they never do uh like subtractive
Readable.
governance, taking stuff
Yeah. Yeah.
out. And we sometimes run into this phenomenon that we encounter, let's say, policy, and we weren't there when it was established, like almost like we come in later.
Come in
And
later. Yeah.
there's this concept called Chesterton's fence. I don't know,
Yeah.
by Chesterton. So the idea is like this: you are in the countryside, and there's a fence, and and you feel like, oh, this is in the way. So the impulse would be, oh, let's get rid of it. But then you say, huh, maybe it's there for a reason. Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe it keeps the wolves out or whatever. So we should not touch it. And the problem I see, and is that especially if you don't understand why something is there, it's a problem. And I think it's also a problem in holacracy, and
Yeah.
that's why I proposed to actually make an amendment in the Constitution that would force you
Cool.
to explicate what the reason is for, or the tension behind putting up a fence. Because
Oh,
if you
that's
know
cool.
that, and if you see,
Yep.
it is no longer the case that this tension is no
Yep.
longer valid, or the situation has changed, and you can now safely remove the
Yep.
fence. Wouldn't that be nice? So
I love that. That makes a lot of sense.
yeah,
Yeah.
maybe that could be tool supported, or something, but that's just an idea. We have flexibility and stability. So of course, we want stability, and we also want flexibility. And what happens if flexibility is not available? What happens in organizations? What do you find, and how would you view that through the lens of SOC, or structural oriented
Yeah.
collaboration?
Well, I mean, just like anything would happen where, if you've got, I don't know, if you're holding on too tightly to your steering wheel when you get in a crash, you're going to do more damage because it's too rigid, right? It's like structures, yes, they have this, the polarity of needing to be stable to sustain something, but they don't just do that. They also need this flexibility because in real life, right, you end up with these different issues where it could be too rigid. And so if the rule is rigid and rigidly enforced, but reality is pushing against it, no matter, prohibition or, throughout history, we have plenty of ways to show, oh, you know what, this rule might have been too stable, too rigid, not enough flexibility. What reality does is it says, well, this needs some flexibility, so we're just going to get it some other way. We're just going to work
Right.
around it, right?
That,
Or
that's
managers.
a very rational thing to do for actors and organizations. Yeah, and it has been described as, what is it called? Practical illegality or something.
You know what's cool about that? I just found out that yeah, the Cool's work.
Yeah,
So I have been calling this for the past few years. I had called it strategic non-enforcement,
yeah,
right? But I think as far as I understand, it's probably going to be about the same kind of phenomena. Yeah,
right, right.
yeah,
So basically, there's a rule, but we don't you look the other way when it's about enforcement, because it may actually be irrational for the organization as a whole to not kind of get bogged down in like just being the rule following type, or
Ex-
stop at the red light at 2 a.m. and nobody's
yes,
around or something like that.
exactly. Exactly. I think that's really important. And the Chesterton's fence example is, or the metaphor is really important. This idea that what we often see as, oh, these are problems, this shouldn't happen. Oh, there's a lack of enforcement or consistency. To just jump right to, therefore, we need more strict enforcement, or we need to, further specify or get even more detailed in what the expectation is. Sure, sometimes that works. Sometimes it takes you in the wrong direction and makes things worse.
Mhm. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about alienation. That's a concept you bring up. So what is this about in terms of rules? And I mean, we touched upon this briefly, but
Yeah.
how would
Yeah,
you?
I can try. And I say that because this is one of the fuzzier, or like I feel like it's pretty close, but I'm not settled with it of like this is the way to say it and define it. Um, the question that this tried to answer is kind of like, well, why do you care? What is it? How could we evaluate whether a rule is good? How can we evaluate, the structure of an organization in a way that's not just about the output, right? Because this is part of the issue I try to raise, is we can't just look at like compliance. That tells us something, but I try to make the argument that I can give you all sorts of scenarios where you have compliance, but you've got other problems, right? You've sacrificed legitimacy for short-term compliance, let's say, being mandated to do something. And sure, that might work once, right? But then the degrades. So I'm kind of like, what is this degrade? What is that though that I'm sensing is like a way to try to evaluate what structures do well when they work well. And so what I ended up coming up with is kind of like this parameter as opposed to like a specific kind of value. So for example, other systems would say, well, what you need is participation, right? They would say, oh, a good governance system means that those impacted by the system should be able to participate.
Mhm.
And I look at that and I kind of my sense of it is like I think of that as a good way of doing this something with the system, but not like the only way that that can kind of work. That can't be true that that's the only way to do it. I go back to the consent issue, right? And I would say, yes, so participation maybe on the front end, that's a good way to get to something. But if that's the only way, then what about systems where participation is not going to be that realistic or functional? Then we're back to, I guess you have no solution or you have to throw the whole thing out. And I don't buy that premise. So I'm trying to figure out a way to define what is a good, healthy system. And it's something around this idea of non-alienation, which means like a do no harm kind of standard, right?
Mhm.
More like we're trying to avoid adding structural or systemic issues on top of whatever the issue it is, right? Let's try to make sure that the system itself doesn't contain bugs that can be avoided.
Right.
And I'm not even sure if that equates, like non-alienation doesn't really sound like that. It sounds more like the participation issue, where I go back to like I'm not quite sure the right way of saying it, but I needed to get the paper done. So I that was as far as my thinking had gone at that time. I think it's defined as like degrading the status or degrading the standing, like not trying to degrade the standing of someone in the system, um but the way I just said it is maybe a little bit better.
Oh, the internet was gone for a second. You cut out. Can you hear me, Chris?
I said whatever. Yeah, I can hear you. I thought you were
Okay.
just in deep thought.
That's good. It's probably been recorded, whatever you said, so it's fine. I think let's just continue. So you write here the evaluative question is whether the system taken as a whole preserves agents as participants who can orient, act, and recover without mind reading or degradation. So that's kind of the question
Yep.
that's how you
Yep.
would judge something as non-alienating, right?
Alienated. Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
we have other key claims. Let's just touch upon them quickly. Changing structures is usually more effective and humane than trying to change people, which I really resonate with this
Yeah.
kind of whole thing of holacracy, I guess.
Yeah,
So
totally.
tell me more about this.
Well, I mean, this is now we're getting to the meat or the juice where it's like, well, if this is true, this idea, and I'll give an example. So like instead of trying to, oh, actually, I used one on the paper. Let's say, yeah, participation, there's a few people in a team that don't speak up very often. They're quieter, or they take longer to process. The changing people approach, the cultural psychological approach would be something like, maybe you talk to those people, you try to encourage them to speak up, you try to make, it clear to them that you want to hear their contributions. Maybe you talk to other people and say, hey, can we try to make more space for them? Maybe you coach them on, standing up and sharing their ideas, and you coach other people on, supporting them when they share. You can do all that, and that's all fine, right? But the structural, changing the structure would be something more like, you know, um, having, taking turns, an idea shared, and you call on everyone. Everyone's got their own space and it's facilitated, back to the enactment piece. It's in such a way that it makes it clear when it comes to that person, there's no time limit, right? They can take their time to gather their thoughts, or maybe you call on them last to give them longer to gather their thoughts. But it's a consistent process. And the first time it happens, they still might not say much, right? But it helps establish this is an expectation of how we're going to structure this interaction where you have a reliable space to say whatever you want and no one's going to interrupt. I'm going to make sure, right? That's kind of the idea. It gives you so much more control over the let's say, I can't say the outcome, or I don't want to say the outcome, but it gives you so much more influence to work towards the outcomes without trying to control them, right? That's part of where the lack of humanity comes in, is when you try to like,
Yeah.
you need to change who you are so that we can achieve some sort of organizational thing, is so nasty.
Yeah, I think that's I would call this transgressive
Yeah,
in
that's a good word. Oh, that's a good word.
you know
Yeah.
that organizations try to change people or empower them. Even that is like kind of in Holacracy we kind of
Yep.
frown upon, like, oh, the boss needs to empower the people to
Yeah.
and so on. So we rather we have different norms around this, I guess. So yeah, that makes sense to me. Then the other thing we already touched upon when we talked about um, flexibility and stability. When structures are underdifferentiated, systems will compensate in other ways. And this is again the idea if things are too kind of too stable, mainly namely the negative pole of that would be rigidity, right? So if you look at it
Hmm.
from a polarity management perspective, each of these poles has upsides and downsides, and the downside of stability is rigidity, and the downside of flexibility would be chaos, right? So you
Yep.
would naturally try to go to the upside again.
Yep.
And so if you do, yeah, you have the phenomena of strategic non-enforcement. You have shadow
Mhm.
power phenomena, which you say are kind of also can be used as diagnostic indicators for what's going on, right? So you
Yeah.
use these
Hmm.
concepts to say, okay, let's look at what happens here and to draw conclusions about like the nature of the collaboration here and how
Yeah.
it's being looked at.
Yeah. Can I just add one thing on it? I mean,
Sure.
it's kind of been in the background. You did say something about it, but it's a good occasion to repeat it. So this idea of, the diagnosis of the system or what to do about it, I would say part of my approach that feels really important, I'm trying to argue, is this focus on participant navigability, meaning all of this stuff. When I say diagnosing, I mean people in that system. In other words, it's possible someone outside the system might look at the group, I don't know, and try to assess whether they're doing it a certain way or the right way. But I'm leaving that out. I actually don't care about that in my scope. I'm only talking about people that are somehow inside the system. So even like I use the word analyst, right? Which others tend to use, but they mean an external analyst. And I mean it more of this, all of my four roles are participant roles. So it's still a participant, but it's more, an example maybe would be like an HR person, right? It's like they are analyzing, oh, a manager said this, created this policy, and the team is, in an uproar, and they're being brought in to help kind of resolve the issue. The HR person is kind of like an analyst, meaning again, they have some stake typically in the system. Yeah.
Okay. Um, all right. So you draw some conclusions or have some what you call implications. Yeah. So you have
Yeah, I mean,
structure
yeah.
first, leverage. So what does that mean?
What was it? What'd you say?
Structure first, leverage.
Yes, yeah, I mean that's the conceit of this is structure orientation, right? Which it just gets back to like, hey, I want to make it clear, everybody, please just stay open for a moment. When I say making rules matter and I say an orientation around structure, you're likely to think that I'm then going to say, yeah, forget about norms or yeah, forget about culture. Like I am not saying that. One of the early version of this structure-oriented collaboration was structure-oriented culture, meaning I was trying to kind of say, no, I'm using a cultural view, but what I'm saying is, how much does that culture care about their structure? Because if they do care about it, they've invested it in legitimacy. Well, then you could change the words and you will literally change the expectation, right? Like this is the promise of what making these words explicit is supposed to be able to provide. You can go to a governance meeting, you can propose a new role, it can be in code, and now that role exists in some sort of substantive, hermeneutical way that it didn't before. And you can't do that unless people have bought in to that as a legitimate way of doing things. And so, yeah, that's kind of the central point is like we're looking at how to make people's words and expectations and commitments matter.
So you first you say structure first, sequencing discipline. Like first, let's try to look at how can we change the explicit structure before we, maybe use the other levers that we have, like
Yeah.
actually directly coaching people, right? Okay.
Yeah, and it could be quick. It could be quick. It could be like, oh yeah, there isn't one. Okay, so maybe we need to move right to coaching. Right? It goes
Okay.
back to like it's not intended to be conveyed as like only just it's a sequential thing.
Okay. Then you have legitimacy as minimal design constraint. Um,
Well, and
so.
I can also just tell you, I mean, despite how, what's not despite, but above or more simply, even though the paper, I had to lay it out according to some standard, back to rules, right? There's standards about how things need to be explained. The implications that are written here are just some examples. For
Mhm.
me, I'll just state it hopefully more simply, which is the implications potentially is very wide ranging. There's a lot of disciplines that that this would have an impact on because they have not defined rules the way I'm defining them. They're not using rules the way, right? They don't have holacracy experience. They don't have a certain kind of like self-management experience to see not so much a way to promote that, but just to account for it, right? Even if you
Don't
don't
have the experiences that wouldn't be needed to even come up with the
to
distinctions,
even
right?
yeah to even recognize, oh, that's a thing that happens actually. And
Mm.
so the implications from a research perspective are very wide ranging, but from a practice perspective, the idea here is you could within your own system as a citizen or as a manager or as a leader, you could actually do substantive stuff, I would say, pretty much immediately. Part of my interest is providing a lot of like say this, don't say that, and code it this way versus that way. Some diagnostic tools I'm trying to work on, but the idea is make it really concrete and applicable.
All right, so let's slowly wrap up, looking,
That's
minding
fun.
the structure
It's
of
fun.
time.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
right. So just to fall back on the established agreements that we had. So what's next for yourself with regard to the structure-oriented collaboration? What are you currently working on? What are you hoping to, explore next, maybe, or and where is
Hmm.
this leading? Is this going to make Holacracy practice better or all practice better?
I have no idea. I'll tell you the honest truth is like I have been so, about 2 years ago, some insight. I think the basic was like, oh, it's about how much the culture cares about the structure. Let's say some version of that. A simple idea, but it lit up everything in my mind. I was like, oh, it's like I see the matrix. All these things I know about stuff or had in my back pocket. It's like, oh, I wonder what that's. Suddenly all made sense.
Hmm.
But it made sense in a kind of like it's like I get it, but now I need to try to explain it. And some of the models came out earlier than others, but it's been a nonstop, like everywhere I look, I tried to define it in the paper of like, this is the perspective. And when you use this formula, almost like you take this kind of perspective and you're looking for these kinds of things, almost all social phenomena that I look at, new things start to pop out. And so I'm just writing, constantly writing, trying to keep up with it, and constantly trying to find ways to look for people that are interested in, I almost would just say helping. Like, oh, yes, that makes sense. Let's actually do that. I could list out 15 research projects, that could come from this, but I'm, kind of trusted source. I do use that Tim Kelly's process, his purpose work, and I feel pretty clear I'm doing what I should be doing, which is just trying to keep up with articulating the things, and very excited about anyone who's even somewhat interested in like, well, how would that apply here, or could we create that? I think it's just dying for more energy, more focused energy on specific issues, and I would love to jump in. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. So I really, I must say it really helped me understand some more some phenomena better in Holacracy practice. I think it's a great start. As you say, it's just a work in progress in a way. It's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
the stuff is being developed as we speak, and I think it has a lot of potential to. It kind of once you assume this perspective, it enacts new data, right? It
Right.
so you see new things, and maybe that feedback loop will flow back to you hopefully, and
Yeah.
yeah, we
Yeah.
can build this together, or the community of practice can hopefully also feedback some of their insights and how this works for them, right?
Yeah, exactly. Holacracy
Okay.
folks are important. Yeah. Because they get so much of I would say the basic distinctions or the importance. They've had the experience bit. So those are the easiest people I think to talk to about it because they already, like you said, can immediately recognize some of these elements. All right. This was so fun. I got to run. Thank you so much for reading it and taking all this time. I had a
Yeah,
blast.
it was a pleasure, and maybe if we have future conversations about this, and we see where it goes, I wish you all the best.
I would
Thank
love that. I really value, yeah, your thoughts and ideas on it. Cool. All right. Take care of yourself.
you. Okay, bye.
I'll schedule with you. I'll use your link and I'll schedule another one with you.